Our guest today is Tim Smit. Tim was born in Holland and educated in England. He went to the University of Durham to study anthropology and archaeology, and then spent some time in the northeast as an archaeologist. Since then, his career has taken him to music, and then as founder and director of the Eden Project in Cornwall. Tim, when you look at your own education, educated I think in the south of England in private education, private school, it looks like a fairly traditional form of education. Was it like that? I mean, did you enjoy it? Has it determined what sort of man you've become? Do you think back about it with affection?
I loathed it. I absolutely loathed it, but that wasn't because of the schools. It was because of the attitudes which at that time were expressed. I mean, we're talking about the 60s through till, I don't know, mid to late 60s, when it was still incredibly class-based, and people were, it was quite a cruel sort of place. And I was big, so I could play rugby and all that sort of stuff, so I fitted in. But I think my Dutch roots, my sort of, if you like, socialist sort of credentials felt rather bruised by the experience. But it taught me that I never wanted to send my own children to private education, so I felt that I got benefit from it that way.
And you stuck at it. You went to Durham, did archaeology, did anthropology, and then got a job that used your degree. So, because one of the questions I was going to ask you was that when you then went into music and then eventually down to Cornwall and the Eden Project, was that sort of rebelliousness kicking over the traces of those early years schooling? Well, why didn't you stick at archaeology?
I would have. The hot summer of 1976 was when I qualified. I would still be doing it today if the pay had been okay, but the pay was so bad. And I had a rock band and we were playing the local hops and things. And I was earning more in a night than I was in a week at the Bowes Museum. I thought I thought I'd chance my arm, do music, and then I'd perhaps go back to archaeology, but as it happens, I haven't. But maybe the Lost Gardens of Heligan was a form of archaeology. Maybe.
I was actually going to say, if you actually look at where you are now in the Heligan and compared to that, you can see the link. But you were successful in music. It wasn't something you weren't a drifter at that time. You were very successful in what you did. You had a very successful career in music. Yeah,
no, I was very, very fortunate. Well, we just struck lucky. We worked with a couple of acts, had a couple of record deals, then we had some hits, and then made some money, and I was flying all over the world. And I hate flying, so it was eventually that got me out of the music industry, because when you end up having a scotch at 9 o'clock in the morning to get on a plane, you realise that's not good for your health.
It's not the way you want to spend your time.
No, but that kind of showbiz background is actually really helpful when you then move into something more formal, like garden restoration or education, because you realise that some of the showboating is actually quite a helpful way of highlighting things to make things more interesting, to make people engage.
Yeah. But the other thing that struck me is what you've done in each of you. You've had a number of careers so far. Is that you've been a risk taker. You've been an innovator. What drove you to make those decisions? It's not a career path that many people take.
No, it isn't. But the trouble with success is that people then, in hindsight, think that you were destined to go down a particular route. If they only saw the razor blade difference between success and failure, and the fact, I mean, I put my house on the line 3 times, and there were times when I thought I was going to lose everything.
So what's the join between the music industry and Cornwall?
To be honest, I fell out with working with lots of prima donnas, and I decided I was going to go into film music and build a studio in Cornwall. The decision for Cornwall was completely random. I was on holiday there and saw a house I liked. I hadn't even really thought about how far away it was from London. My wife and I talked, and I said, look, if we can sell our house in London in 48 hours, I'll move. And we did. Wow. So we ended up in Cornwall without actually really much of an idea of what we'd do.
So you didn't have the projects in mind at that point?
No, not at all. It was a complete sort of whoop, leap.
Right.
And then I met a guy who had inherited this estate, which was called Heligan, and he didn't have any money, and he said, would I like to see it as an archaeologist? You know, because we started talking at a party, and he invited me to go and see it, and we cut our way around it. And I fell in love with it, and that day decided to give up the music business. And just did it. But I've always done that. I've always trusted my instincts.
I read something about your own description of yourself as an environmentalist, and I think it said, or somebody said of you, that you're not a sandals and nut cutlets sort of environmentalist. So what kind of environmentalist does that make you?
I was very heavily influenced by a man called Richard Sambrook, who set up Friends of the Earth with Jonathan Porritt, and then went on to become a leading light at the International Institute of Environment and Development after Barbara Ward was there. And Richard and I became firm friends. He taught me a number of things. Number one was that when you become older in life, do not succumb to this myth that you make your best friends when you're young, because if you leave yourself open to making friends later on, it's so rewarding, which I thought was a terrific thing. And the other thing he said, I saw him talk to an audience once where he said, who here would like to see fresh drinking water available to everyone on earth? And everybody put their hands up. And he said, those marvellous charities like WaterAid and whatever, who here believes they can do that? And no one put their hands up. He then leant forward and he said, the problem with all of you, is that you want to be seen to be a person who changes the world, but you don't actually want to change the world. Because if you really wanted to do it, you would know that the only people capable of it have got names you can hardly bear to pronounce, like Mobil, BP, Shell, and the real world, the real innovation of the next generation, our generation now, is going to be to realize that those attributes of business, if you could harness them to the attitude to development, that's where the secret lies. And I found that totally inspirational, and that's where my head is in terms of breaking down barriers, the demonization of business, or in fact, the, if you like, the hippieing of NGOs. There's some very, very good people in both. And I think you probably have noticed this as much as I, that within business today, there's, over the last 18 months, 2 years, there's a big change, a real big change. A lot of the people in business actually want to make a difference. The fact that they're in a business is not the point. They're individuals, they want to make a difference. And I think we're living in very exciting times because of it. If you look back at this period, this actual period, the next 10 years, from 300 years hence, I think you will see a moment which will be equated in terms of historical importance to the Reformation or the start of the Renaissance. I really do.
What the tipping point has been reached.
Yeah, I think we've reached it. I think we're about to change. I think our whole attitude to business is going to change, the way new companies develop through social enterprise and what have you, and our whole approach to costing, if you like, what were the free services of nature will change.
Right. Okay, let's just look at the work that you're doing in Cornwall now. You're at the Heligan and now at the Eden Project. Let's concentrate on the Eden Project. How did you get into it? When you started it, how did you think it would turn out? I mean, it's now, you know, acclaimed throughout the world. Was that your ambition?
To be honest, yeah. We had to write business plans and things for the bankers and for the civil servants who were going to make the decision. And we were very cautious because we knew if we overclaimed, they wouldn't believe us. So we said we'd have 500,000 visitors. But to be honest, I always believed we'd get 1 million plus. Yeah. To be honest, it sounds awfully arrogant. I wanted to build the Taj Mahal of the environment movement. I wanted to build a place that people would stop looking at environmentalists as if somehow we were jolly nice, you know, to have around to dinner and to have a bit of a conscience, but not capable of doing something. And I realized that being able to, you know, trade punches with the so-called big boys and build something really beautiful and totally fit for purpose was a really important statement that the environment movement had changed.
Well, I want to come on and talk to you a little bit about what you do and your education projects at Eden, but how central was education to the planning of the project?
Education was totally central. I've always loved teachers. I mean, I think if the most valuable thing in your life is a child and you entrust them to a person, surely that person should be the most valued person in society, and I really hold to that. I wanted to see how we could make subjects which, in our case, the environment, but in its widest sense, including livelihood, how we could bring it to life in such a way that it was effortless, so that people wouldn't think of it as being taught, they would see it as being part of understanding the world around them. So we kind of styled ourselves the world's first rock and roll scientific foundation. We're very tongue-in-cheek, of course, but we wanted to make sure we used no jargon, as little Latin as possible, and made people laugh a lot. And we did lots of tests. One of the great things about having that many visitors and a big site is that we can try things out. Like we set scientists to compete against artists to see whether they can get a message across. And at Eden, the first thing I needed to get across was that without plants, there's no life on Earth. And most people, you say that and they go, yeah, but how do you convey that? And we had these artists compete with our scientific team. And when all the kids came in, they walked straight past what the scientists had done, you know, lots of boards with pictures of leaves and photosynthesis. And the winning artist had actually done a Heath Robinson model with the music of Elvis doing Wooden Heart. And there was a man and a woman and a child and a dog and a cat and a breakfast scene. And over a period of 3 minutes, everything that was made from plants disappeared from this tableau vivant. Right. And then the mum and dad turned around and their clothes came off and they were absolutely naked, which made everybody laugh. And it finished with the cat, the milk disappearing, it falling out and its eyes popping out. So everybody called it Dead Cat. Yeah. But everybody who goes to Eden leaves knowing that without plants there's no life on Earth. Yeah. And that set us on a course really of realising that you could be funny about these things. And the big establishments, the big institutions were very sceptical about Eden to start with. You know, our friends, now friends at Kew and
the respectable.
And yes, and the Natural History Museum. A lot of scientists worry about the way their peer group regard them. and think they might be, it's a horrid phrase, dumbing down, but they may be being over simplistic. Simplistic is a good word. And I think when we started to get those big visitor numbers, they started to come and think, well, actually, maybe there is something going on here. And it's quite noticeable throughout the country now. There's a lot more light, if you like, introductory, dip your toe into the water stuff going on, isn't there?
Yeah. See, I think one of the interesting things is what this tells us about what's going on in schools. I mean, and there's two ways of looking at what you're doing at Eden. Right, we've got what goes on in schools, which is a type of learning not similar to that which you've just described goes on at Eden. And you can see Eden as being something that's an adjunct. You go there for a day and you have this marvellous experience and you relate it at school. But there's the wider and I think more interesting discussion about what can schools learn from what you do at Eden in terms of how they teach children. I'm not quite sure where you would stand on that. I know you don't want to be critical of schools because I know you hold teachers and schools in very high regard. But sometimes do you think to yourself, well, if I can do this at Eden with these children, why can't schools be as adventurous and creative in their classrooms? And is that a debate that needs to be had?
It is a debate that needs to be had, but to be honest, if I was in a position of genuine power, and of course power in a democracy is terribly difficult, isn't it? But if I was an autocrat, I would actually change the whole bias of the country and make education the #1 thing, but in a way that we actually ask, in a very grown-up way, what do we want out of this? And I think there's an awful lot that can be achieved if you set yourself a target of creating I think you might refer to it almost as a baccalaureate type attitude, a wide polymathic experience. Because I don't see how anybody can make the best of life after school if they haven't had a polymathic induction into all the pleasures of learning across a wide area of things. And I know it's very middle class, but I think Alan Bennett's The History Boys is about as good as it gets in terms of demonstrating the difference. And I think almost any teacher watching that would have smiled, you know, in recognition at that battleground between...
They've heard the dialogue, they've heard those arguments and the stuff.
And I wouldn't start from a point of view of being critical. I would just put the word delight into education. Because on the back of Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, is a review from an unnamed critic from The Observer, which said, I loved this book, it made me feel so damn clever. And that's what great education should be about, that act of revelation which sends a shiver up the back of your spine.
And you do some work with teachers as well. I mean, as well as courses for children, you have courses for teachers. Is that what you're trying to achieve with them? Are you sort of almost like a professional development opportunity for teachers? And yeah, how much do you feel you've got this mission that when teachers leave you and go back to their schools in inner city London or rural Cumbria, that somehow they're teaching in a different way because of what they've experienced with you?
Well, it's part mission, part therapy group, in truth.
You bring the two together, I suppose you do quite well.
Well, we show them what we do. I mean, we do a number of things, as you know, that are very experiential. I mean, we do two particular things which are very smiley. We do the Great Chef Challenge, where kids come and they have to travel the world to find the ingredients to a particular meal they're going to eat with us that day. And it's a lot of fun, but actually the amount of things they learn just in that journey of going to find the ingredients around our biomes is terrific. And we also do this thing called Don't Forget Your Leech Socks, where they have to pretend they're going on an Amazon expedition and they go into a room and have got to choose X weight of stuff that they're allowed to carry with them for a week in the jungle and identify various plants that were good for them and bad for them, and then they go into the biomes and do it. And they just love it. We've now extended that into the British countryside because there's something rather ridiculous of getting them familiar with the jungle and not doing it on Dartmoor or whatever. But I think people... My favourite saying is one by C.S. Lewis, who says that while science may lead you towards truth, only the imagination can lead you towards meaning. And I think it's in the imagination that we're not perhaps serving our children as well as we could. Because I think formal learning is terrific in terms of putting a whole lot of stuff there, but you also need space to dream. And dreaming is actually really, really important, and people often think that it's not useful time to play. You know, we did something at Eden which really moved me and has really influenced me a lot. I wrote a story called The Alien in the Orchard, which is premised on an alien arriving in my orchard and giving me a gift, because I saved its life, of a pill that I could give to everyone on Earth that would have the talent in it that would enable everybody on Earth to search for that which they call happiness. Yes. And I had 3,000 letters to me about people telling me what should be in those pills. Gosh. And that really shook me, because Number one was people felt you ought to know where you sit in nature in terms of humankind. Number two, your mind and your body, you should know as much about it as possible. And the third thing, this is almost unanimous amongst all 3,000, was that you should be able to put yourself in the shoes of another. There are lots of ways of phrasing that. But after that, what really was amazing, people thought you ought to be able to dance and to sing and to express yourself with your hands through painting or drawing, whatever. For that many people to realise it's fundamental, it's not an adjunct, it's something about your own language, how you speak about yourself, I think it's something we really need to look at, because...
And to some extent, you're bringing two things which are often seen as contradictory together. You're talking about the importance of skills and experiences like that, and a little while back you mentioned about teaching science, and we don't teach science very well, we don't get enough science teachers, and it's an area of great worry. To some extent, that's a curriculum area where we are least likely to use those things you've just been talking about. Is that part of the problem, that somehow we've got a curriculum in a world in which we split the aesthetic from science as though they're completely separate things?
Yes, because when we start, after you know, the period that I'm sure you love too, there's Huxley, Lyell, Darwin, where the world was what you studied and science was actually the observation of natural phenomena. And there was a delight in it, wasn't there? But as soon as it became...
A discovery, yeah.
Yeah, but as soon as it was divided into ologies and things, you know, this isn't a novel thought on my part, many people have said this, it kind of almost sterilized the interest because you didn't see the whole thing as being related to you. It's like storytelling is fantastically important. And I wonder whether part of the science curriculum ought to... Because we have a lot of science postgrads come to Eden and we put them for a week with our theatre group before they're allowed on site. And what we say to the PhD students is, once you've gone through this week, you have to now explain to children why what you're researching is important. And they find it absolutely riveting. But you see, if you put scientists around a campfire with a drink in their hands and say, now, tell us the story of why it's interesting. Start with a story as if we're all 6 years old. It's fascinating. But most people don't have that gift of being able to build up a story.
It's a narrative of life, isn't it, to some extent? Yeah. What feedback do you get from teachers and students? I mean, you know, how do you measure your own impact or your own success at Eden? And I think one thing that interests me, once they've gone back to school, are they able to keep in touch with you? So are you beginning something that carries on once they're away from you?
Yeah, we do. There is a network of the schools that have been to us. We have, I think, 37,000 children come a year.
That's a lot, of primary and secondary, right the way through the age ranges.
And we try to be as supportive as we can, but part of what Eden is about them taking what they like from us and then developing their own stuff. Because they know what to do. Teachers know what to do with their own pupils because, you know, they're not systems, these are real flesh and blood. But what they like is just having a touchstone for this is. Can you see how this can be improved? And we love that kind of relationship.
And to some extent, they're new challenges. I often think that teachers must feel that pressure every time there's a national or world crisis. Solving it somehow placed on their shoulders about educating the next generation. So, is there an element of that when they see you? They see you dealing with some of these very complex issues, and to some extent gives them confidence to take them on with children.
Well.
Broaden their horizons, I think.
The broadening of horizons, yes, but also the bravery to say no. Because what happens, if you take global warming, it's becoming like a new religion, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, yes, it's taking place, no one denies that. But the passion with which everybody's embraced it, being the crisis, is quite interesting, because it's as if everybody has a vested interest in it now being so that everybody changes in the same way so no one gets an advantage. There's a kind of strange hidden tech. If I were to say to you, global warming is one of 20 things which are just as likely to do for us, whether it be huge epidemics, whether it be the problem of an aging population, equity issues. Teachers can't teach all those things. What they can be brilliant at is getting people to just ask, what is fair? What is fair, without politics at all? What is fair? How do you run a society? Because personally, I think the biggest battleground isn't global warming, and the dealing with global warming is actually an adjunct of us learning how to create healthy communities again, in the true sense of communities. Because many people don't seem to understand that a community, it comes from the words communos, together in gift. It's not about a geography of people. And if we could create moments where groups of people understand how uplifting it is to collaborate and do things, as opposed...
Yeah, not necessarily be in the same geographical area. Sort
yeah,
of,
but I mean, our country is not actually very healthy, but people want it to be healthy. And I think we're not telling stories that make Britain today come alive for the people who live here. We're telling too many stories of the past, and we need to be telling stories about those of us who are here and the great future we can have together, and also why we should actually be on the same side. I mean, I think the most influential thing I ever seen in my life was a big rock concert in Rotterdam. 10 Hells Angels terrorized 10,000 people. I remember thinking then, what happened to the good guys get organised?
Yes, that's
and I think it's time for the good guys to get organised.
Right, yeah. One of the things I've read about when I was reading about some of the things you said, there's often a feeling now it's this notion of community. That's what I want to get at, because there's some people who seem to think that the only way we'll get community back is if we get rid of a lot of technology and travel and moving away and living away from where you work. You don't think that. I mean, from what you've just said about your description of community, you think somehow there is a way to bring forward the traditional benefits of community, but with all the benefits of modern living and technology and the rest of it. I think this is something that's really important. I'm sure will be a huge challenge for today's children when they become adults. That how do we recapture something that is the essence of community in the world in which we live?
Well, I think like most good things, the complex hides in the simple. I would start by trying to make everybody who lives on every street in Britain meet everybody who lives on their street.
Even their next door neighbour.
Yeah, yeah. I went to a conference recently about innovation, and I was really aggressive because they wanted me to be contentious, and I said, milk. Let's talk about milk. Let's talk about Tetra Pak. Let's talk about that wonderful innovation. I said, big company makes a lot of money. You get your milk slightly cheaper. I said, how many hundreds of thousands of old people now don't have a social service of the milkman? Right. Who costed that? You know, and no one does. And we've got to be brighter. We've got to be brighter and gentler and kinder, because I think almost everybody I've ever met is a good person, but we're just unhappily positioned. And I think social occasions, moments that make people glad to be together are just fantastically important. And we can do that. I don't think it's difficult.
Just so that we've got this right, we've talked all the time really about what you do with children of school age at Eden, but to some extent you embrace lifelong learning. You've got educational opportunities for adults, and I think you also, I mean, you're bound to take on school leavers as apprentice. You talked about your PhD students. As an employer, you're receiving if you're right, it's a horrible word, but the results of the education system. How do you find the youngsters that come to you, or the not so youngsters that come to you for jobs?
Variable.
Strengths and weaknesses?
Funnily enough, the greatest weakness is lack of confidence.
Yes.
Most children or young adults that I meet, you can get them to raise their benchmark incredibly quickly if they feel respected, trusted, and they get the right support. We find that if we employ really good people to teach them, they become really good really quickly. And
the environment, the setting in which you're doing it, the flexibility goes back to that inspiration and creativity that you've got. Have you ever been tempted to replicate the project elsewhere? Obviously you can't represent the geography of it. But
14 different countries have approached us, and we've turned them all down because we felt that the vanity of doing it elsewhere, we're not like Disney, it's about attitude. Yeah. The fact that we've got
not a brand name in that sense.
No. We did say to the United Arab Emirates that if they wanted to do an Eden project, we'd do it, but they needed Arab architects, Arab engineers, Arab poets, Arab artists, Arab horticulturists, the whole lot.
Has they taken you up on that? I mean, have they done that?
They were just completely appalled because they thought, well, we want your Eden project. And we said, in that case, bye-bye. You don't understand.
The nation almost as money can buy it to some extent.
Yeah, but it's not interesting. Mr. Smit, what bank account would you like £5 million? You don't understand.
But presumably you do think if they did get all those things you said they should have, it is a replicable model.
Yes, but it's about attitude. It's about attitude. It's not about a geography of what it looks like. It's about this fusion of technology, the arts, and science, with the humanities of actually just telling great stories. They're centres to hold moments, if you like.
As we said already, there's this great national debate going on at the moment, and the turning point's been reached in people's awareness. When you look at the nature of that debate and what government is doing and the way, I suppose, in terms of political leadership, we're taking on sustainability, environmental issues, are we getting it right?
Well, as an individual, I would say no. But that is simply because I believe we've arrived at a state where those in politics have to understand the difference between being a politician and a statesman. And I think we've arrived at a point where it needs to almost be above politics, where we actually say, to define our generation, we need to actually have a radical, exponential cultural change, not you know, the small steps. Because I think to be able to meet the challenges of the next 30 years, we're going to have to really upgrade what we do with our education system to make us prepared.
To some extent, our conversation has been a mix between huge optimism about what you've been doing and the results of it and what is possible and the change in people you see, and cautious pessimism about perhaps not having got the narrative right as a nation. You know, if I was to ask you in terms of the issues we've been addressing, are you an optimist or a pessimist, what would be your answer?
I'm 95% optimist, 5% pessimist. There's an irony about human nature, isn't there, that we only bring the best out of ourselves when we're under pressure. And I think, in a sense, maybe that's why we all embrace the idea of global warming and the catastrophe with the frisson, that we want to have a disaster that can put us all shoulder to shoulder fighting a common
A new war, or
yeah,
new enemy.
It's a tragedy, really, that we're really asking a question: how do we, if you like, harness the spirit of war to a time of peace? It may be rather clumsily phrased, but you know what I mean.
I know what you mean.
Because I think we all want that. It's a kind of spiritual yearning with a small s, you know, a desire for meaning and belonging, and you know, feeling that actually putting a roof over our heads and money isn't actually the most important thing. Actually, it's a sense of fellowship.
Well, 95.5 aren't bad odds, so thank you. Tim Smit, thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure.